All right, my name is Dr. Nathan Slovis from Haggard Equine Medical Institute in Lexington, Kentucky. What we're going to be discussing today is the Breeders' Cup information from 2013 in regards to exercise-induced pulmonary hemorrhage. And again, this is just data collection. It wasn't really a research project. We're just collecting data. Myself, along with Dr. Mike Spirito, Dr. Barry David, and Dr. Noah Cohen from Texas A&M help analyze the data. So the rationale for this study, Breeders' Cup, back in 2012 and 2013, prohibited the use of furosemide amongst their juvenile horses. Those are horses that are the 2-year-old horses in their sponsored races. In 2012, the lay people thought they noticed an increased incidence of exercise-induced pulmonary hemorrhage. And some of them were saying that it was so severe it was coming out the horse's nostrils. But there was nobody there to collect this data and see if this was actually observed. So what we ended up doing on behalf of the Breeders' Cup was to analyze horses with the use of endoscopy and determine the impact of the prohibition of using furosemide in juvenile horses. And was there an increased incidence of exercise-induced pulmonary hemorrhage? And so what we ended up doing is we said we scoped them as well as we did a physical exam, just observational. Were these animals stressed after the race? Were they having difficulties in regards to recovering after the event? Increased respiratory rate, increased heart rate, signs of stress. So there were many limitations to this study. It was not randomized. It wasn't a controlled clinical trial. It was strictly observational. The size of the study was small. There were 78 horses that were raced that were considered juvenile. 55 of those enrolled in the study. And ourselves, endoscopists, were not blinded. That means we knew what kind of horses we were scoping. So there could be some conscious and unconscious biases, going on here. And we must interpret these results with care and caution. So the design of this study, contact owners and trainers. It was strictly voluntary. And then what we did is after they volunteered their horses, we performed upper respiratory tract exams with our endoscope and lower respiratory tract exams, going as deep as we can down that trachea. And we looked at animals that were racing on Lasix and horses that were not racing on Lasix. When I mean Lasix, that's furosemide, that's the medication. And it was conducted during the November 1st and 2nd in Santa Anita during the Breeders' Cup World Championship. And we recorded the degree of hemorrhage, and we assigned a grade 0 to 4, which I'll explain shortly. We also recorded the time that we scoped the horse after the race was over. And again, observational physical exam. So we can see bleeding out the nostrils, we see right here, but majority of these horses aren't going to be bleeding out the nostril. Bleeding from the nostril is quite rare. You look at a Japanese study that was done in the early 2000s, less than 0.15% of racehorses were bleeding out their nostril. So that's why we had to use the scopes. And when we grade them, there's a grade 1 to 4. That's what practitioners routinely use. Grade 1 is maybe just one speck of blood. It may be the size of the lead on your pencil, very small amount. Grade 2 is a small stream of blood. It may be 1 or 2 millimeters in diameter. Grade 3 is usually more than one stream, so 2 or more streams, or enough blood that will cover about 1/3 of that trachea. And grade 4, as you see right here, is the entire trachea. So you can get an idea of what our grading scheme was for this. The important information about the study, the endoscopists, there were no significant differences between the distribution of our gradings. So we didn't have like one endoscopist that was harder in regards to grading or easier on the grading scores. We were all pretty much the same, so that was significant. There are no differences in the grading scores when we looked at the data. Time to be scoped, no significant differences between the races. These animals were scoped within 30 to 45 minutes after the race. That's important. If you wait too long, you may miss some of these lesions. And the weather, one day wasn't worse than the other day. They were both picture-perfect days. So the overall results, 70 horses were raced. We had 70% of the horses, 55 horses that is, volunteered for the study, which I thought was great. You know, the trainers are involved, the owners are involved. You had 70% volunteer, which is volunteer for this is amazing. And you can see the grades of the scores. Grade 0 means you had no evidence of bleeding whatsoever. These were all the horses that were on furosemide and weren't. You had 55% had no evidence of bleeding whatsoever. 22% had grade 1. So you look at that, 77% of the horses had negligible bleeding. We consider anything 2 or less in regards to bleeding that we notice in the trachea should be negligible. Shouldn't really affect the horse's performance or cause any ill effect, so to speak, on these horses. So how about the animals that received furosemide versus the untreated horses? These were California-bred races. So these are sponsored races for California-bred horses only that were not part of the Breeders' Cup World Championship, but they were also juvenile horses, and they had the option to run on furosemide. So we use this small group of horses as our so-called control horses because they both race on the same surface, and even though they may not be the same caliber by any means stretch of the imagination of some of these Breeders' Cup horses, they're still good quality horses. So we looked at the furosemide versus untreated. 74% of the furosemide horses were scoped versus 69% of the untreated horses were scoped. So again, pretty much the same numbers in quantity. What were the results? Scores significantly greater with furosemide than for untreated horses. So what you're looking at is that these horses that were treated with furosemide tended to have a little higher hemorrhaging score. Scores greater than 2, significantly greater with the furosemide group. That 36% of those horses had some evidence of bleeding that were greater than 2 versus 7% of the untreated horses. So we'll get back to talk about that a little more, but how about turf versus dirt? That really wasn't part of the study scope. Ours was strictly looking at exercise-induced pulmonary hemorrhage, but we had some numbers. We wanted to look at it. It really wasn't statistically significant between the two, but in regards to turf versus turf versus the dirt, EIPH statistically greater on the dirt versus the turf. So when I told you earlier there wasn't a statistically difference between the turf and dirt, I meant in regards to the horses enrolled. But when it comes to actually looking at the data, the animals that raced on dirt, 60+% of them had some evidence of exercise-induced pulmonary hemorrhage versus 23% of the turf. If you're looking at significant bleeding, that's greater than a score of 2, really not significant between the two groups. But there must be a caution when looking at these numbers. It was not designed to look at surface. They were underpowered, selection bias for these cases, but just some interesting information here. Now, one thing we want to look at was the animals that were not given Lasix, did they run slower races or faster races? Was there any differences in times that can affect bleeding scores? And there is no really difference in the distance or the times of the race between these two groups. So we can't say the animals that did not receive furosemide, with this small data analysis, it said they bled less when they were not given furosemide. So we were wondering, did these animals race slower? Therefore, they didn't have as much exertion, as much stress. And that wasn't the fact. Pretty much the times are not statistically different between the two. So fillies versus colts, when you look at that, again, there wasn't any real big difference between the fillies and the colts. So what this study did was hopefully bring some future studies and some questions that could be answered in the future in regards to the use of furosemide. In this study, there's a lot of selection bias. Well, we talked about animals that raced on furosemide tend to have higher bleeding scores. But again, these horses, what in case they weren't given Lasix? They may have bled even more. And animals that were not racing on Lasix during the Breeders' Cup World Championship, some of the trainers and owners may have said, you know what, I'm not going to race my horse in the juvenile races because I know my horse could be a bleeder. So you got a selection bias on those horses that were racing without Lasix. Trainers may have pulled the horses that were prone to bleed because they knew they couldn't use Lasix. That's called a bias. At the same time, these are 2-year-olds. You know, a lot of 2-year-olds, you know, you tend to see less bleeding in 2-year-olds. So again, the goal of the study on behalf of the Breeders' Cup, and that's what we were hired to help on out, was did it cause any harm on these horses that were not racing on furosemide? And from this data collection, we can say during this event, it didn't seem like these horses were harmed by any ways of not racing on Lasix. Thank you.